bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So this practice of vipassana or insight is for the development of panya, wisdom. And by wisdom, we mean seeing things in their true nature as they actually are. Yata bhutya nanadasana, the knowledge and vision of things as they are. Normally, we don't see things so easily in their nature. We are deluded by our desires and our fears and so on, which bewilder and confuse the mind. And we're trying to cut through that and see the actual real nature of the process of the arising of dhammas. And wisdom has different aspects. Two different mutually reinforcing aspects are the discriminating wisdom and the wisdom of equality. The discriminating wisdom is that power which can discern the difference between this and that. So this is why we try and make the effort to observe phenomena individually, separately. We don't confuse a mental feeling with a physical sensation. We don't confuse a mental formation with a bodily formation. We try and distinguish the individual characteristics of each phenomena in order to see them clearly. This aspect could be likened to sorting pebbles. Let's say you've got a big bag of multicolored aquarium gravel and you dump it out on the table and you sort them out, the red one in this pile, the blue one in that pile, yellow one in that pile, and so on. You pick up each pebble and you look at it momentarily, you know its color, and you put it in the correct pile. And that's what we're doing with the mind. We're sorting the phenomena according to their particular individual nature. But then there's the equalizing wisdom, which is looking at things from actually a deeper perspective and seeing those characteristics which are common to all conditioned phenomena. So every Dhamma which arises to the mind, although it has many individual characteristics, be categorized in many different ways, it still is fundamentally the same in three important characteristics. This is the tilakkhana, or the three characteristics or the three marks of all conditioned phenomena. And these should become more and more evident to the mind as the process deepens. That is dukkha, anicca, anatta. Suffering, impermanence, and not self. Dukkha is the first characteristic. It's also the central theme of the Buddhist teaching, in that the Four Noble Truths all revolve around dukkha. There is the origin of dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the cessation of dukkha, and the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. So it's first of all important to be clear about what dukkha actually means. Suffering is not a perfectly adequate translation. It's too narrow because dukkha is a characteristic of every moment, of every phenomena that arises to the mind, and it's inherent in the object itself. So there are two problems with using suffering as a translation. Although it works in some contexts, there are two big problems. One is that it's too narrow in the sense that we can obviously know from experience that in our existence as human beings, there is certainly suffering, but there are many moments that are pleasurable as well. And there are probably the majority of moments for most people, most of the time, are just neutral. They're neither particularly pleasant or particularly unpleasant. But they're all dukkha, whether they're pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So obviously suffering doesn't quite work. The other problem is that by calling it suffering, we're emphasizing the subjective quality. It's the observer, it's the person who suffers, but the dukkha is inherent in the object. It's not something we impose on the object, it's there for us to discover. So dukkha really means something like, I don't think there's any, first of all, there's no one English word that can adequately translate it. There have been many attempts and they all have some difficulty, but it's pointing to something like the imperfection, the provisional nature, the incompleteness, the brokenness of phenomena. That nothing which occurs in samsaric becoming is perfect or self-complete or fully satisfying. There's a sense that manifestation itself, the coming into existence, is a kind of brokenness, a flaw on the perfection of emptiness. So dukkha points to the brokenness or the imperfection, the incompleteness or provisional nature of samsaric becoming, and it's inherent in each object. Impermanence or anicca is the transitory nature of all phenomena, and that can be seen and contemplated on different levels and different time scales. One of the contemplations the Buddha recommended that we do every day is the contemplation of death, to make ourselves completely conscious of the unavoidable fact of our own death at some point. The time and place and manner of our death is unknown to us, but all that we know is that it will occur. So there's impermanence on the scale of a human lifetime. There's also impermanence on larger time scales, and the Buddha talked about this from time to time on what we could term either geological or even longer cosmological time scale, that even the great ocean will one day dry up, even the sun will one day burn out. There's nothing that will last forever. And this can actually be a useful contemplation because we tend to think of things like the mountains or the ocean as symbols of stability and permanence. But the deepest level of contemplating impermanence is on the level of momentary transitoriness. And this is what we should be seeing in the mind as we examine closely the passing phenomena, that there's a constant flickering in and out of existence of dhammas, that nothing persists, everything is really only momentarily existing. Normally we are fooled by what is called the illusion of continuity, because subsequent moments will resemble each other. There's a sense that things persist, but if they're contemplated at the level of dhammas, that is at a kind of atomic level, we see that only persistence is an illusion. There's only a momentary flickering in and out of existence. And we can see this in the mind. You see the constantly changing nature of the mind. The third characteristic is anatta, not self, which is a kind of special case of the general principle of sunyata, emptiness, that nothing exists as a self-existent entity. Nothing has an independent nature. It's only a momentary result of cause and effect, and it hasn't got a self-substance. One way this is expressed is to say nothing exists from its own side. When seen from the inside, it's empty. It only has the illusory appearance of some solidity from the outside. In the special case of this, as applied to the individual person, the idea of anatta is very important. It's a central teaching. It's the teaching that is unique to the Buddhas. We don't find this teaching of anatta in any of the other philosophies or religions of India, or indeed of anywhere else. The particular phrasing the Buddha used, anatta in Pali, in the Sanskrit would be anatman, is a reference to the prevailing view in India of the time that human beings were possessed of what was termed an atman, a permanent abiding essence that transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime, that never changes. That's the imperishable core of a person. And the Buddha said there is no such entity, that the Atman does not exist. This is on first acquaintance with this idea, it seems counterintuitive and seems very difficult. People react to it. What do you mean I don't exist? Here I am. Here's my driver's license. You can see here, I'm a real person. But when it's examined, it begins to make more and more sense. And what we're doing with the insight meditation is looking at the process of the mind very closely. We see at each moment there is an object and the knowing of the object. And in the words of Mahasi Sayadaw, there is just the object and the knowing, and no third besides. And the third besides is the self. In other words, there's nobody doing it. There's an object and the knowing, but nobody's making the object and nobody's knowing the object. It's just a process. It's empty both sides. Subjective emptiness and objective emptiness. And you can look for a self as much as you like and you never find one. What we find when we look inside, we find the body, we find feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And each one of these can be further subdivided, further examined. That's why they're called khanda, which means bundle or heap or pile or aggregate. It's each one of these is compound. And the closer we examine, the more we see the interrelation and between the factors, and nowhere do we find a substantial self. This is the simile of the chariot in the Milinda Panya. That King Milinda asked Nagasena, the monk, he asked him to give a simile to explain this doctrine of not self. And Nagasena said, "How did you come here today, Your Majesty?" He said, "I came in my chariot." He said, "If we were to break up this chariot and put the boards over here and the backboard there and the axle there and the yoke over there and the wheels over here, in this pile of parts and pieces, could you find for me the essence of chariot?" And after some more back and forth questioning, he gets the king to admit that the name chariot is without real existential meaning. It's just a designation for this pile of parts and pieces when they're assembled properly. So it is with a person, a man or a woman, or any entity. They are just a designation. The individual is just a designation for this complex of processes that is occurring. And look as much as you might, you never find a self-essence. In a sutta, the Buddha talks about the way in which we fabricate the illusion of a self. And he said there's 20 possible ways to create an illusion of a self. If we take the 5 aggregates, that is body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, any one of these can be held in one of 4 different ways to be a self. We can identify with them in these 4 different ways, as either to say, take the body and say, I am the body, or the body belongs to me, or we say, I am in the body, or we say, the body is in me. And the same can be done with feelings and the rest of them. So 5 times 4 is 20. So we tend to have this mental habit of identifying. We may identify with consciousness, for example, and think I am consciousness, or consciousness is me, is in me, or any of the other combinations. But this whole idea of me is actually a completely unnecessary fabrication of the mind. It's redundant. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't add any value to the process. We don't find it anywhere. It only exists in our mind because we haven't looked closely enough. And it becomes a kind of a lazy shorthand for understanding our nature. And it's not just an error without consequence. It causes us a great deal of distress and suffering by identifying, by taking ownership of the aggregates. All of our anxieties and fears exist because of an identification with the self. We have an illusion that this body or this mind belongs to us or is us, and it ought not to change, but it does change. It comes to shift and change constantly. And when there's some diminution of one of the faculties or of the body, then this is mentally felt as a great suffering because it's an assault on this self. In another place, the Buddha gave a quite powerful simile. He was sitting with the monks in a park, and in the distance, they could see some people had come from the village gathering firewood sticks, making bundles and carrying them away. And the Buddha said to the monks, "What do you think, O monks, when you see those villagers taking the firewood sticks away? Do you get upset? Do you weep and wail? Do you beat your breast and cry, 'Please do not take the sticks'?" And the monks were kind of puzzled by this. He says, "No, we don't care. Why should we care? They're not our sticks. There's nothing to do with us. We don't care." And the Buddha said, that attitude you have toward the firewood sticks, remember that. That's exactly how you should feel about the body, about feelings, about perceptions, about mental formations, about consciousness. So a good shorthand to remember this teaching, if we take those, there's 20 ways of creating a self, a very simplified way of remembering that, to making it integral, is a simple phrase, "Not me, not mine." And to apply that very specifically, if you find yourself caught in anything, identifying with anything, being anxious about anything, taking ownership of anything whatsoever, internal or external, whether it's the body or a bundle of firewood sticks, if you find yourself being troubled by it, remind yourself, "Not me, not mine. This is not me, not mine." So this is approaching the teaching of not self in that same way we talked about with the development of vipassana as being specific. It's not of great value if it's just held as the teaching of not self, if it's only held as a kind of theoretical construct. You might be able to convince yourself of it philosophically, but that doesn't really cut in and make a difference in your understanding and in your being. Although it can set a background, it can be useful. It's not really nearly enough. You need to make it integral and personal and real in the moment. And as we said, with each object that arises, to see this is not me, this is not mine. And to see that the knowing is not me, not mine. We don't identify with that either. There's just the knowing. There's nobody doing the knowing. The more you can make the sense of emptiness, of not self, real for yourself, to make it an integral, intimate part of your understanding, the lighter the burden of existence is, the freer you feel, the more spacious and expansive the mind becomes. And one of the benefits is abhaya, or fearlessness. An arahant is completely without fear. Fear comes from wanting to protect what is me and what is mine. And when you see that there is nothing that is me, there is nothing that is mine, then there's no fear. And freedom from fear is a great liberation. The Buddha said to the Brahmin student Mogaraja, in answer to the question Mogaraja asked him, which was, how may I escape from the gaze of the Lord of Death? And the Buddha told him three things. He said, be ever mindful, Mogaraja. See the world as empty and abandon thoughts of self. So three things. Be ever mindful. That is to have sati. We usually translate sati as mindfulness. And sati is, of course, a key quality of developing vipassana. Older books used to translate sati as recollectedness. And it's kind of an awkward word, but it's probably closer in literal meaning than mindfulness. Sati is really remembering to be present. The word sati is, in Sanskrit, smriti, is very linked to memory, but not memory in the sense of dwelling on the past, but remembering your place, your situation. So being mindful, you're not confused. Right? You're clear because you remember to be present. There's a story that I read in a book by Uspensky, who was a student of Gurdjieff. And superficially, it doesn't seem very Buddhist, but it just uses a different language, but it's really talking about the same thing, about sati. He said one of Gurdjieff's teachings was to always recall that you are present. You know, often you're in a situation maybe with other people or in a busy street, and you're aware of your surroundings, but you kind of forget that you're there and that you're part of the scene as well. And Ospensky says that he was walking in the streets in a big European city, trying to practice his teaching, remembering himself, remembering his presence. And as he went about his ordinary daily business, and at one point, he went into a tobacconist shop to get some pipe tobacco. And as he was examining the samples and being aware of the different aromas and textures, he lost himself in the sensuality of it and forgot the practice. And he says it came back to him a half an hour later, after he'd made another 2 or 3 stops. And he said the intervening time seemed to him as if it was a half-remembered dream. He wasn't really awake because he had been without sati. So sati is remembering to be present. And it manifests as the application of awareness.
It's 2 o'clock.
So one is aware of what is happening, and one is aware of one's own intentions and feelings and thoughts. One's aware of the position of one's body. One is aware of any sensual inputs, sights and sounds, and odors and so on. So be ever mindful. See the world as empty. Now, this is applying the teaching of sunyata, or emptiness, to the phenomenal world. That which we perceive and cognize is without self-substance. The Buddha also said in another place, when I say the world, loka, I mean this fathom-long body. Because what we experience as the world is not actually the world at all. What we experience is our sense impressions as processed by perception. We never touch the outer universe directly. What we actually experience, the world we actually live in, is a simulation created by our perception based on sense perception. So there's a great emptiness. And what the outer world actually is kind of a moot point. The Buddha was always very reluctant to talk about metaphysics and ontology. These are pointless questions. They do not bear directly on liberation, because the universe is essentially an abstraction. It's an inference from our perception. abandon thoughts of self. Any thinking that references a self nature is a delusory thinking. And to give that up is liberating and is opening to wisdom. And this idea can be useful to us in small ways as well. One of the mental habits that we should try and cultivate is not to reference self, to avoid the I am construction. People limit themselves and constrict themselves by ideas such as I am an angry person, rather that they should think anger is arising. To see it objectively, not take ownership of it. And immediately it loses a lot of its power. To try and see things as a process. Not me, not mine. Don't take ownership of phenomena. Don't identify with phenomena. So these three simple rules: be ever mindful, see the world as empty and abandon thoughts of self. They are a way of stating the essence of the practice. And this is what we should be striving towards, moving towards. So all these three characteristics, they're inherent, that is dukkha, anicca, anatta, they're inherent in every conditioned phenomena. And they are not immediately evident because of certain characteristic ways in which they conceal themselves. Impermanence, I've already mentioned, is hidden by the illusion of continuity. We tend to think of things persisting because subsequent moments resemble each other. Not self is or emptiness is disguised by what is called the illusion of compactness, that we tend to see things as discrete units. It's the organizing principle of our mind. We organize things in our mind into discrete entities, but there are actually no discrete, self-contained, independent entities anywhere. There's only a vector play of forces. Everything arises by way of multiple conditions. And the conditioning factors are themselves intrinsically without self-essence, but are the result of other conditioning factors ad infinitum. The reality of dukkha has a kind of a different quality masking it. The other two, they're kind of philosophical ideas, the illusion of continuity and the illusion of compactness, and they require a bit of explanation to make sense of them. But dukkha is said to be disguised by something very immediate and visceral. It's by change of postures. And this has the works on both a literal level and on a more metaphorical level. We hide dukkha from ourselves by change of postures. And this is why beginning meditators often have a lot of suffering in the body because they're not used to sitting still. The human body is naturally a complex of dukkha. And when we sit in our comfy chair at home, if you relax, you'll notice that even though you're perfectly at ease and comfortable, every few minutes you'll be shifting your weight, you'll be moving your arm, resting on the other elbow, or recrossing your legs. No, you can't possibly sit still, even though if anyone asks you at one particular moment, oh yeah, I'm perfectly comfortable, then a few minutes later you're moving again. So when you change postures, you redistribute the dukkha, and it's not evident. It's like change is as good as a rest. You switch the complex around. But when you sit still in meditation, which for many people is the first time they've consciously made an effort to sit still, is if they take up meditation for the first time, they immediately are aware of all the dukkha in the body. And on a metaphorical level, it works too, that on a mental level, let's say the mind is constantly shifting and fidgeting and not content to be still. Because when it's still, the dukkha becomes evident. It's one of the first things that may become evident, and restlessness arises. And you somehow think or the mind sometimes has a kind of an illusion that if we just shift over here, do this, do that, then it'll be better. And it takes some practice to learn to be at peace and content with being still, internally and externally. So getting close to concluding, I'll sum up what the main points here are: that we are trying to develop wisdom by clearly observing phenomena in both their aspect of the difference between phenomena, the particular individual characteristics, and also on a more deeper level, the universal characteristics of all phenomena, which are dukkha, anicca, and anatta. And the more those become evident to the mind, the more liberated, expansive, free, and bright, and clear, and awake the mind becomes. So I'll leave you with those reflections.